Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Petra Wendt, and I'm principal of Queen Margaret University. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight, but I'm particularly excited about tonight's poetry reading on the topic of language, community, and confidence. And by giving a performance rather than a formal lecture, our speaker, Liz Lochhead, brings something really new to the Edinburgh lecture series, so I'm really excited about it. Now, Liz is, dare I say, well, I shall say it, a national treasure. She is a poet and a playwright, and she is currently the National Poet of Scotland. Her much-loved works include the play Mary Queen of Scots Got Her Head Chopped Off, her translation and adaptations of Molière's plays, and, of course, as you know, her poetry. I'm proud to say that she is also an honorary graduate of Queen Margaret University. And that really reflects the relationship between her work and our teaching and research in drama, culture, and creativity. And also, to some degree, our work and research in speech sciences, focusing on the Scottish dialect and Scottish accent. But that's another story, far too much to talk about tonight. And I must admit that we've been really eager to find an excuse to get Liz to come here and to give a performance. And this year's Edinburgh Lecture Series, the theme, City, Community and Home, gave us the perfect excuse, given her interest in issues of Scottish identity. I'm sure that Scotland will feature heavily in her poetry tonight, and she gives personal and anecdotal views of the relationship between Scots English dialect and Standard English. I've also noticed the badges I on a lapel. I don't know what that means. She might talk about that later as well. Another key theme in Liz's writing is, of course, the female perspective now and throughout history. And as principal of a university, first created to provide educational opportunities for women, and someone whose own PhD thesis, my PhD thesis, focused on female poets of the Renaissance period, Liz's interest in the female experience really does resonate with me. I'm also pleased to say that Liz's performance will be followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions, and that part will be chaired by Professor Alan Guloran, who's waiting in the wings over there. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Liz. Liz.
Thank you very much. It is a huge pleasure to have a ringing microphone. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm very grateful for that honorary doctorate from Queen Margaret University. I think it was in 2005. I was trying to remember exactly when. It was the day after the terrible bombings in London on the Underground. That's what I can remember about it. And so it wasn't yesterday. And even at the time, I knew there was no such a thing as a free lunch. So here I am. So it's a huge pleasure, and thank you very much, Petra, for a lovely welcome tonight. I'm not going to give any kind of lecture at all, and I'm not really going to give a performance. I'm going to be quite intimate and anecdotal, and I'm going to talk about community and, my one. And I thought that maybe the audience would be sitting there thinking, well, they could compare theirs. They could get into a dialogue inside their own head if I get very personal about mine. And I looked at my computer, and there was this document, which I don't know what I did it for. It said, Lanarkshire Girl. And because last week I was out there in Lanarkshire wandering about for the first time in 20 years, I typed it out, and it became kind of a nice structure. I hope so, anyway. So the first poem that was in that document is actually called After the War. And it's kind of, well, not so much anecdotal, autobiographical. Autobiographical for me, anyway, because you're always making it up. It's never... It's never straight autobiography. After the war was the dull country I was born in. The night of Stafford Cripps's budget, my dad inhaled the blue haze of one last capstan, then packed it in. You were just months old. The Berlin airlift. ATS and Remy badges rattled in our button box. Were they surprised that everything was different now? Did it cheese them off that it was just the same? Stuck in one room upstairs at my grandma's, jammed against the bars of my cot, with one mended feather-stitched jumper drying among the nappies on the winter dykes, the puffed and married maroon counterpane reflected in the swinging mirror of the wardrobe. Radio plays, them loving one another, biting pillows in the dark while I was sleeping. All the unmarried uncles were restless, champing at the bit for New Zealand, the Black Country, Corby. My aunties saved up for the new look. By International Refugee Year, we had a square green lawn and a 12-inch telly. A little autobiographical statement comes after. I was born on one of the coldest and darkest nights of the year, on the day after Christmas in 1947, in the Motherwell maternity, a month prematurely by emergency caesarean section to a mother who apparently had been initially convinced she was suffering from acute indigestion brought on by overindulgence. In eating, I have to say. My parents weren't exactly teetotalers, but they didn't exactly roll out the barrel either. Both seasonal, and in that an entire jar of the mustard piccalilli that she'd craved all through her pregnancy had been scoffed at the Christmas dinner. Now, this was almost a year after the legendary blizzards of the January and February of the previous winter, which had seemed to a long-suffering, still under grimness and rationing, post-war British public to be just the last straw. Mum and Dad were still homeless, almost 4 years since they married in uniform, just before D-Day. He was in Remy, she in the ATS. So the three of us had to live in one of the cramped upstairs bedroom at Granny and Grandad Lochhead's solid between the wars council house. Number 13, the Broadway, Craigneuk, Wishaw. The Broadway. What an impressive address. Utterly unfazed by references to the rattle of the subway trains, to taxis and to Angelos and Maxis, I always thought, right from the beginning, right from my tiniest, when I was listening to the wireless, when I heard Broadway Melody, that they were writing a song all about us. Here you go. Auntie Jenna and Uncle George, the youngest of Dad's 4 surviving siblings, weren't married yet, so they were still at home too in 1947, 48, 49. Uncle Bill and his wife Auntie Jean had a prefab in nearby Cambusnethan, but they might be there visiting with my 2 cousins and a third on the way. Or Auntie Annie might have come in the bus from her room and kitchen in Partick with baby Anne and big tall Uncle John Skinner still in his Glasgow PC's uniform. So around the tea table on a Saturday was a very crowded place. There was a lot of arguing, much of it about politics. Grandad was a retired miner, a retired Lanarkshire unionist miner. Divide and rule. All his sons had come back from the war. Well, they hadn't all come back from the war. My uncle Robert had been killed in Holland in 1943, but the rest of them, some of them hadn't been in the war, they'd been in the steel yards or wherever, but they were now all arguing, and not necessarily just because they were proddy going to vote Unionist or Tory anymore. So I remember these arguments right away. It's quite strange to be queuing in at the back of a miner, a retired miner, because, you know, when you're wee, you get put in beside your granddad in the middle of the day. My granddad was in bed a lot of the time because he had silicosis, the miner's disease, and I can remember him coughing and coughing. You know, one of the first memories has been up against his back as he was coughing away, and voting Tory. There you go. With, to his son's horror, blue and white Delft plates in the living room of King Billy and so on, you know, blah, blah. So I was still a tiny baby when the Berlin airlift kicked in with the first of the scary standoff crises of the Cold War. All through my childhood, Hungary, Suez, and most tense and terrifying of all, later on in my adolescence, Cuba put the fear of death, literally, into my whole growing up. Nuclear annihilation seemed to be all but inevitable. How could the grown-ups just go on pretending everything was fine? Well, they didn't quite. When there was a current crisis on, I remember them stopping everything and listening very hard to the news bulletins with grave faces, but trying not to let on how alarmed they were in case it scared me. I wasn't fooled, but felt a great duty to not let on how scared I was, because I knew how attached they were, everybody was, how attached they all were to the myth of not a care in the world at that age, have they? Och, they're that innocent, God love them. There was many a sleepless night I watched for the dawn I wasn't sure would come. Or much later, as a teenager, I had mushroom cloud nightmares about the Hiroshima I'd read about obsessively. So, when I was 4 in 1953, we got a house, a council house in Urt Hill, Lanarkshire, a former mining village that now was really a dormitory scheme for Ravenscraig, the steelworks, the giant heart of Lanarkshire steelworks. And this wee poem, which I wrote quite a while ago, and I walked this walk just 2 weeks ago, yesterday, with a friend who left Scotland in 1970. And I haven't walked in this place since 1970 either. I haven't been back to that spot since my parents died 20 and 21 years ago. So this place is literally very vivid to me, because there it was last week, much the same, and the burn that it led to still flowing in exactly the same way. I'm going to go out and do some drawings out there during June. I've kind of already got it penciled into my diary. But this is this place. This was a sort of road. It was called the Metal Raw. It just seemed to me the metal, comma, raw. Of course, it meant the metal row or road. Anyway, so this is the poem. The metal raw was what we used to call what must have really been the unmetalled road or row. A no-cars scratch across 2 farmers' tracts between ours with its brand new scheme and the next ex-mining village. At 4 or 5 or 6 though, I thought it meant the colour though. Metal raw was crude red gravel that you'd better not break your bike on, and that surfaced just the first 100 yards or so, then patched the worst of the ruts on the dirt and mud and clinker of the rest of it. Rust on corrugated iron. That was metal and raw, both. A real remnant of the Iron Curtain, for all I knew, torn and gouged with nail holes along edges that you'd to watch they wouldn't rip the hand off you. Sheets of this stuff crumbled to red dust along the metal raw, among the black cold fires and rags and bits of brick around the place the tinkers still camped a week or 2 each spring with their piebald ponies. Always some story about, among us Waynes, around the scheme or at the swings, about somebody's big cousin creeping close enough to kick the boiling billy can over, about a shaken fist, cursing and swearing, and how far on the light nights that big man with the stick had hunted him. I was wee enough then, on a Sunday walk along the metal raw with Mum and Dad in my good coat, for the Tink's big black dog that wouldn't do me any harm to knock me flying in the mulchy ditch among flag iris and the reeds I called bulrushes, and that might have harboured baby Moses and not one bit surprised me. See, I am talking of the time when I mixed up Meg, she was a gypsy, and that old woman up the metal raw, smoking a pipe outside a tilting lean-to of tarred and patched tarpaulin stretched on hawthorn. And this was the 1950s. We slept under a mushroom cloud, feared Khrushchev and Bulgarin, men in Cossack hats in blizzards of interference on the tiny grey TV screens of the Cold War. This was the time when our mothers, down the new houses, stood on red cardinal doorsteps, far too scared not to buy the tinker's pegs and prophecies. So I suppose that place, that first place, was my community. It was where I lived till I left home, I think in the beginning of third year at art school. I still stayed at home during the first couple of years. It wasn't too far to travel, although I was dying to get away. During that time, I started writing pieces about it when I was about to leave, I think. I didn't realise that, but afterwards, after I looked at them, I realised I'd been a bit elegiac. So a few of these very early poems, I'll just punch them out. This is sort of portraits of some kind of people that were there. I was really chuffed a few years later when my now late friend George Macbeth, the poet, he did a lot of series of talking to poets for the BBC, all way back in probably the late 70s, or it could be in the early 80s, but I think it was the late 70s. And he said to me that he liked these Lanarkshire poems. Now, although he was a posh London literary type, George Macbeth, very BBC, he had actually been born in Shotts in Lanarkshire and been brought up there for a while. So he liked these Lanarkshire poems, the early poems of mine. And he said that he liked them because they were as local and specific as Bruce Springsteen's New Jersey. So that made me quite happy, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, my life wasn't so rock and roll. This was a kind of true story, twisted about some neighbours. You know, nobody could ever get me for libel, because you mix up things, however biographical or autobiographical you're being. This is a wee poem, very early. This is the first 2 or 3 things I wrote, and they're a portrait of that village, I suppose. After a warrant sale. There used to be this thing, you know, where they sold people's effects if they got into debt and so on under warrant. You know, people came around and bid. You know, it was an auction. I don't think anybody in our scheme went to the one that was the warrant sale. You didn't do that to your neighbours, but other people would maybe go. And also, even then, it just seemed brutal and cruel. And yeah, this really happened to a couple of neighbours. Oh yeah, you're supposed to leave people, apparently. By law, you had to leave them a bed and a cooker. Interesting. After a warrant sale, I watched her go. Anne next door, dry-eyed, as dignified as could be expected. The day after they came, sheriff court men, with the politeness of strangers, impersonally, to rip her home apart, to tear her life along the dotted line, officially. On the sideboard that went for 15 bob, a photograph. Wedding day, Walter and Anne. Her hair was lightened, and her heart with hopes. No one really knows when it began to show. Trouble, dark roots. It was common knowledge there were faults on both sides, and the blame, whether it was over drink or debt, no one seems to know, or what was owing to exactly whom. Just, in the end, the warrant sale and Anne's leaving. But what seemed strange, I wondered why, having stayed long past the death of love and the ashes of hope, why pack it up and go over some sticks of furniture and the loss of one's only partially paid for washing machine. Those who are older tell me, after a marriage year or two, the comforts start to matter more than the comforting. But I am very young, expecting not too much of love, just that it should completely solve me. And I can't understand. And this one is probably the one that's been most anthologised in schools, things and so on. These are all the very early poems I wrote when I was 18, 19, 20, just before I actually left Newt Hill, Lanarkshire. And this one is called The Choosing, and it actually gave me an alternative title for the selected poems that came out a couple of years ago. It's not The Choosing, but it's A Choosing, because I think in another day I would have put together different poems. But among them, obviously, there had to be The Choosing. Don't need it. I know it off by heart. We were first equal, Mary and I. With same-coloured ribbons and mouse-coloured hair, and with equal shyness, we curtsied to the Lady Counsellor for copies of Collins' children's classics. First equal, equally proud. Best friends too, Mary and I, a common bond in being cleverest. Equal in our small schools, small class. I remember the competition for top desk or to read aloud the lesson at school service, and my terrible fear of her superiority at sums. I remember the housing scheme where we both stayed, the same houses, different homes where the choices got made. I don't know exactly why they moved, but anyway they went. Something about a 3 apartment and a cheaper rent, but sometimes from the top deck of the high school bus, I'd glimpse, among others on the corner, Mary's father, mufflered, contrasting strangely with the elegant greyhounds by his side. He didn't believe in high school education, especially for girls, or in forking out for uniforms. 10 years later, on a Saturday, I am coming from the library with my arms full of books. Sitting, and I will need to find it. I must be very, very tired. 10 years later, on a Saturday, I am coming from the library. Sitting near me on the bus, Mary, with a husband who is tall, curly-haired, has eyes for no one else but Mary. Her arms around the full-shaped vase that is her body. Oh, you can see where the attraction lies in Mary's life. Not that I envy her, really. And I'm coming from the library with my arms full of books. I think of those prizes that were ours for the taking and wonder when the choices got made we don't remember making. And this one is called Daft Annie on our village main street. I've written down the numbers, but they're not corresponding. I was very, very tired on the train. Here you go. And this next two are a couple of figures from that village. This one was written at the time, you know, late 60s. The latest this poem could be was 67. And another one, a much more recent one, about another kind of mythic figure in the village. These kind of figures, I don't know, they're both very ordinary and they're larger than life. And this is called Daft Annie on our village main street. Annie, with your euphemisms to clothe you, with your not all there, your sixpence short in the shilling, with your screw loose, your crazy tick-tock in the head, your lurching pendulum, slightly unbalanced, with your plimsolls in winter, with your big boots in summer, and your own particular unseasonal your unpredictable weather. Annie, out of the mainstream, Main Street Annie, down at the cross with your religious mania, singing Salvation Army choruses to all on Sunday. Annie, with your unique place, your pride of place in the community. How to every village it's doctor and it's dominie, it's idiot. Annie, with the village kids afraid of you, with your myth of witchery, with your mystery, your big raw bones and your ham-fisted face, with your touching every lamppost, your careful measured paces down Main Street, clothed in euphemisms and epithets. Daft Annie, your epitaph. And this is another semi-mythic figure. This one's a much more recent poem. It's maybe about 10 years old or something. And this is the new married miner. I used to see one miner in the village. It was quite strange because, you know, we knew that all the pits were gone. But late in the afternoon on certain shifts, I would see this miner. He seemed very old. He was much younger than I am now, obviously, but covered in black dust, cycling, incredibly weary, back down our main street. He must have worked in the last maybe open cast wee mine in Lanarkshire up Shotts Way. And there weren't even pithead baths, obviously, because there he was all blackened. And I would be standing there at the Red Cardinal windowsill looking out, and I would see him going down. And in my memory, with one of those peace boxes, you know, on the back of his bike with those things that were wee kind of crossover things that held it in place on the wee package bit, cycling down there. And he suddenly came into my head. Sometime this century, definitely. Yeah, maybe 2002, 2003. And when he popped up and started talking out loud in his voice, he wasn't as I'd seen him then, but as he must have been 20 or 30 years before that, when he was the new married miner. And it became a sort of love song in his voice. My shift is over, that was night time all day long. My love, it's lousing time. Alone among these dog-tired colliers, my druth's for home. Bank up the fire with small coal till I come, and before tomorrow, I'll not think again how sore and small the space I have to hunker in, or how huge and hard but true it pulls against the sky as at the pit head, black against the sky, the big wheel turns. Now my bike's coggling front wheel clicks and squeaks. My cold bones ache as hard for home I pedal, still blacked up like a darky minstrel. My long path home is starved of light, so I must do without. No moon tonight, so round and white, its davy lamp's gone out. Frost edges every blackened leaf, black snot flowers on my handkerchief. Heat my bath scalding, and bonny lass, I'll make the white lace of the lather black. Squeeze the hot soapy flannel at the nape of my neck and scribble long white chalk marks down my back. Put the dark fire to the poker till the hot flames burst in flower. Stretch out the towel and I'll stand up. Hold and fold me. Rub and scrub me as hard as you can till in your white warm arms I'll end up. A pink and naked man, my love, your pink and naked man. And this one, which kind of ends the neutral sequence in a way, almost, it was the countryside as well as being so much the scrabby kind of industrial landscape. There was a farm immediately behind the scheme, and this is probably the first poem that I ever got finished, and it's called Revelation. I remember once being shown the black bull when a child, at the farm for eggs and milk. They called him Bob, as though perhaps you could reduce a monster with the charm of a friendly name. At the threshold of his outhouse, someone held my hand and let me peer inside. At first only black and the hot reek of him. Then he was immense, his edges merging with the darkness, just a big bulk and a roar to be really scared of, a trampling and a clanking tense with the chain's jerk. His eyes swiveled in the great wedge of his tossed head. He roared his rage, his nostrils gaped like wounds. And in the yard outside, oblivious hens just picked their way about. The faint and rather festive jingling behind the mellow stone and hasp was all they knew of that black mass straining at his chains. I had always half known he existed, this antidote and antichrist, his anarchy threatening the eggs. Well-rounded, self-contained, and the placidity of milk, I ran, my pigtails thumping on my back in fear, past the big boys in the farm lane who pulled the wings from butterflies and blew up frogs with straws, past thorned hedge and harried nest, scared of the eggs shattering, only my small and shaking hand on the jug's rim, in case the milk should spill. This poem is called Lanarkshire Girls, and I think it was written in the 90s or so, and written definitely, you know, looking back rather than being right in it as I was when I wrote some of these poems. So this is remembering Lanarkshire girls coming into Glasgow in a red bus through those green fields. And summer annoyed us, thrusting leafy branches through the upstairs windows, like a boy with a stick through railings, rattling us. We bent whole treetops squeezing through, and they rained down twigs, broken bits of foliage, old blossoms on the roof, chucked hard wee balls of unripe fruit, drumming us out of the country. Then it was shabby schemes, gospel halls, chapels, orange halls, doctors' surgeries, the crematorium, the zoo, gap sites where August already frittered the stuffing out of unpurpling fireweed and splintering thistles, till the blank blue sky was dotted with whiskery asterisks. Soon the coherent cliffs of Toll Cross, the many mansions of those lovely red and blackened tenements. Our country bus sped past the city stops, the women in their slippers at the doors of dairies, the proud pubs on every corner, accelerated along the glamorous Gallowgate, juddered by Rita's Gallus fashions and the gorgeous dragons of Terry Tattoo artist, till it spilled us out, 14 years old, dreaming ourselves up, with holiday money burning a hole in our pockets at the corner of Jamaica Street. Now, you might have noticed something about these poems. Petra quite rightly, talked about how I've always been very interested in language. But most of these poems, give or take the odd Scotticism, are in standard English, maybe spoken with a Glasgow accent. It always amazes me when some people can't tell the difference between accent and language. And I don't really have a Glasgow accent. I've got a Motherwell accent, modified through Glasgow. I think I've been living in Glasgow for long enough for it probably to be much more like a Glasgow accent. But as I found out 2 Wednesdays ago, it's not quite the same. There's a lot more country and sort of border kind of speech, even in Motherwell. But this next poem, which sounds completely autobiographical, was actually a First the Phone Call poem. This was written for London BBC educational television to encourage children, 12-year-olds and so, to keep writing at least creatively, you were allowed to do it creatively, in hometown English, Well, obviously that was a worthy aim, and I did want the 50 quid to pay the electric bill or whatever, so I said yes. It's the usual thing with a first of phone call poem. A lot of swearing as the deadline comes up, a lot of cups of tea, and literally tying your leg to the desk and make yourself stay up all night and get it in. I had no idea this poem would prove to be a keeper. I had no idea whatsoever that it would be translated into Birmingham Black Patois. I've heard it's been there. Although I think they would have to do more than just translate the poem. They would have to find equivalents, maybe a completely different story for the poem. Anyway, Birmingham Black Patois and also Cornish, not the language that only 12 people speak, you know, the one that, just Cornish English. So that pleases me, because how I went about it was I just got together all the, I don't like the word dialect. Who does like the word dialect? As my friend Tom Leonard says in a wonderful poem of his from a standard English, absolutely excoriating little sequence of poems that he's got called Situations, Theoretical and Contemporary. He's got one of them starts off with, and the prisons were full of many voices, but never the dialect of the judges. Nice way of thinking about it, isn't it? I said to the woman I didn't like the word dialect because it insinuates that some people speak properly and other people are kind of quaint and funny. And she said, you took my point, but did I want to do it? So I did it. I said, where did they come from? So I said, well, where did they come from, these kids? She said, oh, John O'Groats to Land's End. You want a dialect poem? I couldn't even really write a Glasgow dialect poem that more than half the children in Glasgow in primary schools would understand, obviously. Our lives are getting more cosmopolitan all the time, and our language standardises. So all I did was, as I say, stay up swearing, drinking a lot of tea, and putting together all the dialect words that I commonly use. Many of them that I didn't know were dialect words till people sort of said what. I mean, I didn't know till I was living in Bristol when I was 26 that that wasn't a pinky, or it wasn't a pinky all over Britain, you know. I sort of said, oh, I stubbed my pinky, and everybody, what's that, you know? I said, what is it then? They said, your little finger. So anyway, there's no pinkies in this poem, but so it'll sound like the most I've given you incredibly autobiographical and personal little poems, but this was a confection. There is some truth in it. My grandmother used to say when she put a scarf around you and sometimes pinned it, you know, at the front when you were going out sledging or something, might say to you, oh, now you'll not starve of cold. And I remember I liked that expression because, of course, starving was about food and cold was about cold. But it's those kind of wee things, I think, that get people keeping writing poetry. You know, language kind of gets a little irritation in it. You know, like something that would make a pearl in an oyster, I think. You know, it's a bit of something that makes you stop with language. So anyway, this wee poem. I usually start my readings with it, you know. It's a good kind of, well, I'll tell you why after. It was January, and a gay dreich day the first day I went to the school, so my mum happed me up in my good navy blue napcoat with a red tartan hood, birled a scarf around my neck, put on my pixie and my pockies, said, "Noo you'll no starve," gied me a wee kiss and a kid on skelp in the bum, and sent me off across the playground to the place I'd learned to say. It was January, and a really dismal day the first day I went to school. So my mother wrapped me up in my best navy blue topcoat with the red tartan hood, twirled a scarf around my neck, pulled on my bobble hat and mittens, it was so bitterly cold, said, "Now you won't freeze to death," gave me a little kiss and a pretend slap on the bottom, and sent me off across the playground to the place I'd learned to forget to say. It was January and a gay dreich day the first day I went to the school, so my mum happed me up in my good navy blue napcoat with a red tartan hood, birled a scarf around my neck, put on my pixie and my pockies. It was that bitter. Oh, saying it was one thing, but when it came to writing it, in black and white, The way it had to be said was as if you were posh, grown up, male, English, and dead. You laughed at the right bit. You passed the test. I always know if I don't get a laugh, you know, once it goes into English, that I'm going to have to work a wee bit harder with this audience, or speak a wee bit slower, or something like that. You know, and I thought the second time people hear it, wherever they come from, they can't pretend they don't understand it the second time round. Because how do you understand language? It's by usage. If my 18-year-old nephew uses a bit of new phrase, I can't remember it, you know, it was something the other week. Something was getting boosted and something else was whatever. I don't have to ask for a translation. I just start using it the next day because context teaches you language. I'm going to finish up, before we have some questions, with the one that Alex Salmond liked. It's a kind of community poem. It's the one that he said he liked very much, which was I was quite chuffed by that. I suppose they'd made him read it when he was trying to decide who to make the maca. No, they did. I mean, there was a consultation and various people, apparently, I didn't know anything about this. And it's about New Year's and what New Year's seem to mean to Scottish people across the world. So it's a kind of good place to stop and have a few questions, and then I would like to end up with a poem, or actually probably two poems, one of mine and one of somebody else's. But this is View of Scotland, love poem. So you can think up your questions and I'll probably no answer them. Or I might say, I don't know, because I don't very often. But this does remind me of my mother when I read it. It just reminds me of my mother and some other things. View of Scotland, love poem. Down on her hands and knees at 10 at night on Hogmanay, my mother still giving it elbow grease, jiffy waxing the vinyl lay. This is too ordinary to be nostalgia. On the kitchen table, a newly opened tin of sockeye salmon. Though we do not expect anyone, the slab of black bun, petticoat tails fanned out on bone china. Last year it was very quiet. Mum's got her rollers in with wave set and her well-pressed good dress slack across the candlewick upstairs. Nearly 10:30 already and her not sorted, her not shifted. If we're to even hope to prosper, this midnight might find us how we would like to be. A new view of Scotland with a dangling calendar is propped under last year's, ready to take its place. Darling, it's 30 years since anybody was able to trick me, December 31st, into looking into a mirror to see a lassie with as many heeds as days in the year. And 2 already since, familiar strangers at a party, we did not know that we were the happiness we wished each other when the bells went. Did we? All over the city, off licenses pull down their shutters. People make for where they want to be to bring the new year in. In high rises and tenements, sunburst clocks tick on dusted mantel shelves. Everyone puts on their best spread of plenty. For to even hope to prosper, this midnight must find us how we would like to be. So there's a bottle of sickly liqueur among the booze in the alcove, golden crusts on steak pies like quilts on a double bed. And this is where we live. There is no time like the present for a kiss. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's billed as a question and answer session, but really I just need your help to keep this woman talking because I don't know about you, but I could listen to her all night. So if you have a question, could you raise your hand? And we have a roving microphone. If you just wait until the microphone comes to you, because if you don't use the microphone, we might hear you at the front, but the rest of the audience will not hear you. So who would like to start? In which case it'll be me then. No, the gentleman here has saved me from torturing Liz with my own question.
Liz, I would like to know, what sensation do you get inside you when you feel a poem coming on?
It's just that wee tingle, as you know. You think, I'm going to try and get that. And you don't always catch them, even if you're fishing for them. But what happens is a little bit of, it's not the idea for the poem. You've often got the idea you'd like to write a poem for a long time. It's a bit of the actual language of the poem. You know, it's a wee bit of language turning itself outside in, a cliche kind of seeming to mean more than it normally means. That little, the French call it the donné, don't they? The little given bit. You've got to work hard. If you're given that wee bit, you've got to work hard to find the rest of it. But if you've got a donné, at your peril, you don't sit down and try and write it down and at least keep it, even if you've got an exam tomorrow or whatever you're doing. You've got to kind of begin to, and more than just write it down in a notebook. I don't find notebooks all that useful. Well, they're all right, but I find these notebooks and there's these things written in them and I think, eh? You know? So you've got to do a wee bit of work, maybe half an hour, twiddling with the language once you've got the language. The only way I can describe it is, I used to have, when I lived in that house in Yurthill, the one that my parents lived in till...
You got a phone or anything on you?
I have. Do you want it?
Just can you switch it? Just
Okay.
keep it in mind.
Okay.
Any minute now, my phone's going to go off and I'll be in hell. I think I switched it off, but I'm not that sure. It's quite good. Nobody phones me anyway, so that's fine. What was I saying? Yes, the wallpaper that they put up in 1954 or 5 or 6 was my favourite wallpaper. It was my room. Can you imagine? You know, to go straight from a cot that was too wee for you into a double bed. It was brilliant. I had a green wallpaper and there were these wee crowns on it all over now, I come to think. Wee kind of white and gold crowns. But if you made your eyes go googly, it would turn from white kind of crown shapes all joined together on a green background to funny wee green shapes on a white background. You know, that way you can do that with your eyes. And that's a wee bit like what it is. A bit of language does that flickering back and forward thing. And thanks to that, you kind of have a wee bit of a start. And once you've got a start, you've got to kind of pursue it. How long does it take? Some of them come quite quickly, not that quickly. You might get a draft of it in a day, but you've usually got to tinker with it for a good couple of weeks. Very few of them come that quickly, but you've got to kind of keep going till you've got a draft. And sometimes I leave something for a while and I fish it out, and it makes a bit of sense, even if I've abandoned it, and I rework it and miss out all the bits that didn't work and start again. So it is quite a strange sensation. I've kind of got it at the moment, and I feel that if I told you what I want to write about, it'll die. You've got to keep that a secret until it's... I mean, it's not anything startling, but just something I want to explore. It's not actually quite in language yet. It's still a kind of visual thing. And the visual thing's got to be, I don't know, the word has got to be made flesh first or something. Sounds very pretentious. I'm quite good at sounding pretentious. Well, you'd be pretentious if you got this chance to stand up and do an Edinburgh lecture, eh?
So did that thought just come to you this evening, or is that something that you've been working on over the course of...
Not been working on it at all. Since I did that walk in my old place, I've got an idea that I want to do more than... I definitely at the time, and I can say that, I do want to go back and draw at that barn, draw and paint. I've been drawing and painting a lot over the past 6 or 7 years. And over the past 3 or 4 years, I've been doing it more and more and more. And I'm determined to get back to painting in oils, but so at the moment, drawing quite big and sticking things on things suits me fine. So I know I want to go out and draw, but I've got a wee idea for a bit of something in language. But if I tell you, it'll die. I can't tell you.
Liz, can I ask you, you were talking earlier about discussions around the kitchen table as a family, and I don't know whether it's something to do with Lanarkshire, because my mother came from Airdrie, and I was...
You know what I'm talking about.
I do, and I was brought up by her, and she was always talking about world events and had a great sense of social justice. How would you characterise those discussions round your kitchen table? Were they vehement, the political discussions?
They were vehement, but I'm talking about discussions that I heard before I could really understand them. I mean, we did move into our own house when I was 4, so I was talking about the very, very early ones. They were quite contentious. My granddad was an old bugger, you know, he was a terrible, he was frail because he had silicosis, but he was he wasn't really an Orangeman, but he was definitely a Protestant, whereas my father was vehemently ecumenical. I mean, my father and mother thought that sectarianism was the curse of the west of Scotland, and they fought against it all their life. They thought it was a scandal. But my grandfather thought it was a scandal that his educated son, my dad, who'd actually been kept on at school because a teacher came round and spoke to my granddad when my dad was about to leave school and said he should at least get kept on, at least till he's 18, because he's clever, he should at least get his hires. Of course, after he got his hires, the war started, and he wasn't going to go to university anyway. There was no money for that, but he was already working as a clerk. He came back after 6 years away at the war because he was called up early, and as he was an administrator, he was out last because they had to administer themselves out. So he was away from the end of 1938 to early 1946. So he was a very, very gentle and lovely man, my father. My granddad was lovely, but he was contentious and very different in nature from my father, who had very much his mother's nature. She was a fisher girl from the northeast, and she just used to, she was a bit deaf, so she just tuned my granddad out, you know. It just...
Yes, microphone to the woman in the front row. Thank you.
I enjoyed your poem about your primary school education, and I would like you to tell us your memories of the primary school. Were they able to be creative, the teachers, or was that something within yourself that came later, or did they help you on the children, or was it too much sums and spelling and the sort of thing?
No, it wasn't too much. I loved that. I loved sums and spelling, and it was, the arithmetic, the doing. I remember what was torture was trying to do 45 sums in 50 minutes to sit your qualifying, because I could do them, but I couldn't do them that fast, and you knew you were going to, lose marks for all the ones you couldn't do. No, I just loved school, but we did get a chance to draw and paint and get freedom to do things. We get taught poems off by heart, which is excellent for you as a child. It's no, I've got absolutely no complaints. I was very interested in them. I was interested in all the kind of things that were going on, like they were maiden ladies mostly. They'd come back after retirement to teach us because there were so many of us born after the war, and our education was mostly in tin huts and in playgrounds and things like that. No, I had a very, very useful childhood for a creative person, which is as much as you can say.
Gentleman here.
I was interested when you were saying about going to primary school and having to speak proper English. And that was my experience as a child. You had a completely separate language in school to the one you had in the playground. Unfortunately, I think we've ended up in a situation now where people literally cannot hear themselves speak. That children can neither express themselves in their native tongue, not really understand that when they're speaking in formal situations, they should be using a more standard English. Apparently Scotland is the worst place in Europe for speaking standard English. Germany comes out top.
Right.
So
Maybe people don't need to speak so much in standard English, you know, and maybe it could be a matter of it's no my accent, it's your ears. Because we can, you know, we can all understand more people than people that are speaking standard English. I give you people,
yeah.
I really like swearing actually, but I don't like swearing in public. I like swearing amongst my intimates and friends and so on. You know, I don't like swearing that's not funny, but you know, some people I know are very creative swearers. You know, I really liked, I mean, for instance, I thought the language in the thick of it was very creative and very funny and very, you know, it wasn't very nice. It was very bullying language and so on. And I don't think it's very polite to be like that in public or to bully other people with language. But I think, you know, within different language groups, like my friend Tom Leonard says, I think all living language is sacred. You know,
I quite agree with you. I mean, I've learnt to tune to different languages because I've lived across different parts of the UK. It's like tuning into a radio.
Yes, I would like children to think that it's not either or, but it can be both and.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of Scottish people do. I don't think I did go to school and speak an entirely different language. I mean, that's a dramatisation of a historical force rather than a personal, you know, I mean, that was not an autobiographical poem. It was, you know, as I said, my granny used to say, "No, you'll no starve." My mother didn't speak like that actually, and I spoke quite properly at home, and I spoke quite properly at school, what I thought was properly, which was not that much differently from how I speak now. It's a truth, but it's an exaggeration, and I know that a lot of children, you know, recognise it, particularly Gaels and so on. My friend Angus McNichol, you know, wasn't allowed to speak Gaelic you know, things like that. And I think you're right. I'm all for encouraging people. This is about knowing what language you use where. But also I think it's about the people who speak the supposed formal language, not feeling that they've got a moral superiority just because they do. And feel, you know, if somebody's speaking clearly and if somebody speaks with a desire to communicate and look somebody in the face, the people listening ought to give them, you know, the grace of trying to communicate. I used to get fed up in London when people said things like, "Oh, I don't know what you're saying, but I just love listening to you." Quite soon they did understand what I wanted to say.
There's a gentleman again here in the second row.
Yes, in your opinion, writing poetry, is it a gift or can you teach yourself from a textbook?
You can teach yourself to do it from reading poems. That's how you teach yourself to write poetry, is to read poems and speak poems out loud and to love poems and to love language. It is a gift when you get one. It feels like you know, I don't mean that I've got the gift of writing poetry. I never know if I'll write another poem again. You know, a poem, this wee idea, this wee, you know, feeling that I've got, this thing I'm going to write that I wouldn't tell you what it was. Who knows where that comes from, apart from just life telling you should maybe have a wee try at this, that if you don't go for it, you definitely regret it if you don't try and write a poem you've got an idea for. And you can teach yourself a lot through, once you want to do it, you teach yourself by every means possible. My favourite writer in the world is Alice Munro, the short story writer, who became very famous when she got did she get the Nobel, didn't she? Was it the Nobel Prize? My goodness. When I first came across her, it was 1976. I was living in Canada and she'd never been heard of here. I went to Canada as, you know, one of the first Scottish-Canadian Writers Exchange Fellows, and a nice family who befriended me at the university used to take me home and feed me with their kids and were absolutely lovely to me. They knew Alice and they also gave me her first book, which was called Dance of the Happy Shades. And I just loved this book, and I have loved Alice Munro since. She's just my favourite writer. But she says of writing, of course it's an interest in life and experience, that, you know, that's what makes you want to write. But she says, why you really write is because you love reading. It's because you're in love with books that you want to write, rather than because you're in love with life. And I think that's very true.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a
Gentleman
good
at the
question.
back.
I'm always scared somebody's going to ask me a question. I don't have a clue what it means. And I should, you know, that's the ones, yeah.
Liz, I'm suitably gratified that as a Londoner who's lived in Scotland a long time now, I can understand at least the majority of what you're saying. I thought I might have to have
Well, if you couldn't understand it all, I would be gutted, because I was speaking...
I thought I might need a translator, but...
I was speaking fairly... I mean, most of these were in English, and I thought it was funny why I ended up with the one in Scots. You know, my early poems were in standard English, more or less, with a bit of Scotticisms, because that was what I thought I spoke, albeit with a... You know, and that's what poems that I read were in. You know, it was gradually through... translating Molière, first of all with Tartuffe. When I started working on it, I was determined to write for Scottish actors to do in their own accent. That was all. And I remember Alan Wright, the late great critic of The Scotsman, saying, so is this going to be in Scots then? You know, and I said, absolutely not. But when I started working on it, it was like a mixture of Burns and my granny. You know, and it was set in 1920, and it just came out very vigorously, this inner language that I didn't know I had. Once I knew I had it, once that language opened up to me, then Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off, which was in a different Scots again, but Scots was an option. I don't write much standard poetry in Scots. I do a lot of dramatic writing in Scots. Don't know why. You don't decide these things. Yeah, anyway, your question.
I was lucky enough to see a production of your translation of Tartuffe, and I understood at least a good proportion of that too, which was great. But the question I had was
you'd understand it in playing.
Right enough.
Know, of course you would.
The question I had was, would you consider experience or imagination to be more important in your writing?
I don't really have any imagination, I don't think. I think what imagination probably is running your experience through it, you know. I don't mean I don't make things up, of course I do, but, and, you know, that's what I like to say to people, you know, especially with plays, you know, even with poems. I remember a book of poems coming in. What one would it have been? I think it was the Grimm sisters, so it must have been very late 70s. 1980, it came in and through the door, and I came out, and of course the first thing you always do when you open a new book is you open it at the misprint that you've proofed 3 times and missed. Just happens, and you go, oh. But anyway, I remember some friends were there, and they were looking, because you get the 6 copies, they were looking at it, and we were drinking coffee, and this friend of mine, Hilary, went, page 69, who was he? And I said, I made it up. But you know, people always think poets are being autobiographical, and they always think novelists are being, you know, imaginative. And the truth is that they're both the same. They're both half made up and half, you know, there are autobiographical elements in the stuff that, what's his name did, great science fiction writer who wrote, you know, he was in a concentration camp when he was a kid in Ballard, yes. You know, Ballard's science fictions set in fantastic places are, in a sense, autobiographical. You know, they can't not but come from you and your things that are going on. But autobiographical stuff, you know, doesn't really, you know, count very well. There was a very wicked, lovely poet called Alexander Scott. Some of you might remember him. He was a friend of, he's not lasted as well as McCaig and people like that, but he was very witty and cheeky. And he wrote these little aphorisms about people, like Alexander Trochy, you know, the beat kind of poet. His wee poem would go, Al Trochy, fell mucky. And he'd won about a friend of mine, Jean Milton, who was also at art school, same time as me, and she'd poems out much earlier. And he went, Jean Milton, total recall of sweet fuck all. And that's, you know, so memory and imagine, you know, memory's not enough. You know, so, you know, he was wicked. That was just me quoting somebody else. That wasn't me swearing.
Yeah, follow that. Okay. One more question at the back.
Very simple question. What inspires you?
I think I've been answering that all evening. And nothing inspires me. You know, you've got to kind of work at it. You know, you get this wee, tiny wee, it's not even an idea, something that annoys you and you've got to follow. It's like a wee thread maybe that you've got to unravel and see where it goes. You don't know what you're going to get. You just know that you're off on a wee journey with something you're writing. You don't know where it's going to lead you. The ones that I know where they're going to lead me, you know, when I write them in rhyme and have a lot of fun with the language. And even then you're taking somewhere different by the forcing you to rhyme. But, you know, the things that I write that rhyme, I kind of knew what I wanted to say before I started more with them.
Okay, I lied. I'm going to ask the last question.
Okay.
And it's something that Petra said in her introduction about your badge with the eye on it. And I saw something you wrote the other day which said it's coming soon for I that, I think in reference to what's going to happen in September. And I just wonder whether you think that after September and after the independence vote that there might be more emphasis on Scots words and keeping Scots words alive in the vocabulary in Scotland.
I don't know. I don't know how the vote's going to go, do I? And what I was writing, the person that was talking was Robert Burns. It was a completely imaginary Robert Burns talking doggerel. He was trying to write a poem to put his point across, and he gives up at a certain point. You know, the wee bit in the paper was just an extract, and he gives up because he doesn't like his rhymes. He doesn't like voting the only answer rhyming with voting paper. It's not good enough as a rhyme for him, and he's very frustrated, and he says what he thinks, and then he gets out a perfect line of standard Habby. So the Robert Burns, the fantastical Robert Burns, the entirely made up Robert Burns that I wrote for fun, to make people laugh during what I thought might be a boring evening at the galleries. But it isn't. It's not. Have you anybody been to see? Who's been? Just a couple of people. How did you know about it? Right, you saw in the gallery that it was going to be there? Because it's not been, the publicity was rubbish, you know? They think that everybody will, that if they put out little postcards that say, Dear Scotland, people will find it and then they'll go on Twitter or something like that. You know, a lot of people are quite busy and we need to know what we can go and see a while before to put an evening aside for it, you know? Finding out last Friday that this thing was on, it's not really necessarily good enough, I don't think. But anyway, Burns, as written by me, is cheekily kind of pro-independence. And as for me, I couldn't possibly say how I'm going to vote.
Nice one. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to thank Liz, and I'm going to thank you for I'm going to thank Liz for her, I will call it a performance this evening, which was entitled Language, Community and Confidence. And as Petra said at the start, these three words epitomise some of the work at Queen Margaret University. They fit with the expertise and the values of the university, particularly in terms of language and all the work that we do through our speech and hearing sciences. Community, we have a lot of community engagement, particularly through drama and also our research and residence scheme where our PhD students go out into primary schools and talk to kids about science. But confidence, for us at Queen Margaret University, we like to blend the theory and the practice, and we believe that gives our students the confidence to use the knowledge that they have got at the university to actually use that knowledge. And I was quite taken by one of Well, the closing lines of one of your poems that you didn't quote this evening, which was Connecting Cultures.
Oh, yeah.
And the closing lines of that particular poem are, what we merely say says nothing.
Yeah.
All that matters is what we do. I think that's a very powerful message, and certainly one that I would want to take back to our students.
I'll read that poem to end, and one by somebody great, because they would go together. Sorry, I'm not really fiddling, because I wasn't going to do this one.
You are fiddling.
I'm not.
You've been fiddling
I
all
wasn't
night.
going to do this one. I decided against it.
Well, I'll finish my bit
Here
while
it's here.
she's fiddling. The end of my bit is to thank you all for coming out on what you would describe as a Geidrecht evening. So well done to you for the determination and the doggedness in coming along and participating this evening. I appreciate that. But I would like you to thank our Scots Macker for a rumbustious romp of a performance this evening. I think what you... I know. Just hold on, you'll get your shot in a minute. So this evening's performance has been full of ingenuity, creativity, passion, and insight, and certainly I have enjoyed it thoroughly, and I hope you have too. And if we can show our appreciation to the Scots Macker now.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done. Thank you, and thank you, Petra, as well, for your lovely introduction. I might as well do that poem, Connecting Cultures, because I've been very, very, very local. And I wrote this for Commonwealth Day. That was a good gig. Westminster Abbey. My cue was Rufus Wainwright singing Hallelujah. I had to come in at the end of Rufus. You know, I think that they hadn't really listened to the words of Hallelujah. You know, they thought it would be quite appropriate for Westminster Abbey, but it's not quite as religious a song as they think it is. Anyway, Rufus was a good person to come in on after. So, but this was for Commonwealth Day, and it's called Connecting Cultures, and it's actually a very good end, because I've been talking about a very wee microculture, and this is the big wide world. Connecting Cultures. I am talking in our lingua franca. Tell me, do you drive on the left or right? Is your football team the Botswana Zebras or Indomitable Lions of Cameroon? Can you take me to Junkanoo? And is there mangrove forest? Is it true that a lightweight business suit is the appropriate city garb and shaking hands the usual form of greeting? Are there frigate birds, diamonds, uranium? What is the climate? Is there a typical hurricane season or a wind of change? How many miles of coastline in your country? Is the currency the Kenyan shilling or the Brunei dollar, or is it also the word for rain or a blessing? Do you speak the lingua franca? Communication can mean correspondence or a connecting passage or channel, can mean a means of imparting and receiving information such as speech, digital media, Facebook, the press and cinema. Communications can mean means of transporting, especially troops or supplies. Commonwealth means a free association of independent member nations bound by friendship, loyalty, the desire for democracy, equality, freedom and peace. Remembering how hard fellow feeling is to summon when wealth is what we do not have in common. May every individual and all the peoples in each nation work and hope and strive for true communication. Only by a shift and sharing is there any chance for the welfare of all our people and good governance. Such words can sound like flagged up slogans. True. What we merely say says nothing. All that matters is what we do. Thank you very much.